At 6:47 a.m. on April 14, 1945, Gefreiter Klaus Zimmermann stood inside the rusted iron skeleton of the Klessin Railway Bridge, watching Soviet infantry ford the Oder River 340 yards below. 17 years old, 4 months in combat. 19 confirmed kills. 0 times he'd used this position in actual engagement. His Hauptmann called it the coffin. His squad leader called it the birdcage. Behind his back, the older soldiers called it the boy's fantasy. A defensive position built into the bridge's cross-bracing that shouldn't work. That violated every principle in the Wehrmacht field manual. That would get him killed. But Klaus had watched 3 partners die following doctrine. And doctrine said, defend from ground level. Doctrine said, never isolate yourself above the battlefield. Doctrine said, maintain communication with your unit. Perfect positions, perfect fields of fire, perfectly predictable. And his partners were perfectly dead. The problem was simple, mathematical, and killing German defenders at a rate of 4 per day on this sector alone. Soviet doctrine emphasized rapid river crossings with suppressing fire. Wehrmacht defensive doctrine positioned snipers in earthworks 40-60 yards from the riverbank. The Soviets knew exactly where to look. They'd been crossing the Oder for 3 weeks. Every German sniper position had become a pre-registered target. The average survival time for a sniper in the prescribed position, 11 minutes after first engagement. Klaus had lost his first partner on March 29th. Unteroffizier Hans Dietrich, 23 years old, 5-year veteran of the Eastern Front. They'd been assigned to defend the southern approach to Klessin Bridge. Hans positioned himself exactly as the manual prescribed. Shallow depression, 55 yards from the waterline, perfect defilade from artillery, textbook concealment. He fired twice, hit twice. Soviet mortars bracketed his position in 90 seconds. Hans survived the first barrage. The second one found him. Shrapnel through the chest. He died before Klaus could reach him. Textbook positioning. Textbook death. His second partner arrived April 3rd. Schütze Martin Weber, 19 years old, transferred from a shattered unit near Seelow. Martin also followed doctrine. Different position, same distance from the river. Same tactical logic. He lasted longer. 4 engagements over 2 days. On April 5th, at 7:12 a.m., he fired on a Soviet squad crossing near the bridge pilings. 3 shots, 2 hits. Soviet return fire came from at least 6 positions simultaneously. They'd been waiting for the muzzle flash. Martin took 7 rounds. He died instantly. Perfect form. Perfect technique. Perfectly anticipated. By April 5, 1945, the 9th Army had lost 31 snipers on the Oder-Neisse front using standard defensive positions. The Soviets had refined river crossing tactics through 3 years of offensive operations. They knew German doctrine as well as the Germans did. Every prescribed sniper hide, every recommended distance from the objective, every textbook firing position had become a death sentence. Klaus spent that night studying the bridge. The Klessin Railway Bridge was a 420-foot span built in 1889, a lattice truss design of riveted iron and steel. Allied bombing had damaged the central span. The rails were twisted, unusable, which is why Wehrmacht engineers hadn't demolished it. Militarily worthless as a crossing point for vehicles, strategically worthless for Soviet armor. But the structure itself remained mostly intact, a spiderweb of cross-bracing, support beams, and diagonal struts 65 feet above the water. Klaus noticed something the night of April 5th. The bridge's geometry created natural firing platforms within the truss structure, L-shaped junctions where horizontal and diagonal members met. These platforms sat 50 feet above river level, deep inside the bridge's framework. From ground level, they were invisible. From the Soviet side of the river, they disappeared into the visual chaos of twisted metal. But from inside one of those platforms, Klaus would have an unobstructed view of the entire river crossing zone. He did the mathematics. Standard ground position, 55 yards from target, 5 feet of elevation. Exposure time 8 to 12 seconds between muzzle flash and return fire. Bridge position, 340 yards from target, 50 feet of elevation. Concealment inside three-dimensional framework that Soviet spotters weren't trained to analyze. The doctrine said this was wrong. The doctrine was written for warfare that no longer existed. Klaus climbed the bridge at 2 a.m. on April 6th and spent 3 hours building a platform. He used salvaged boards from bombed-out buildings, wire from telephone lines, and iron hooks fashioned from bridge maintenance equipment. He created an L-shaped nest wedged into the junction of 3 beams, a horizontal floor braced against 2 diagonal supports, with a vertical screen of twisted metal providing frontal concealment. The platform was 18 inches wide, 4 feet long. Just enough space to lie prone with his carabiner 98K, a canvas bag of ammunition, 3 canteens of water, and a rain cape for camouflage. From this position, he had a 180-degree view of the river crossing points. The elevation gave him angular advantage. He was shooting downward at targets that expected threats from horizontal. The bridge framework created visual confusion. Soviet spotters looking for muzzle flash would see it backlit against twisted steel, impossible to pinpoint. And the distance, 340 yards, was beyond the effective range of Soviet infantry return fire, but well within Klaus's capability with the 98K. The risk was isolation, no communication, no support, no escape route except a 50-foot climb down to ground level. If the Soviets spotted him and brought up anti-aircraft guns, he'd be trapped. If they called in artillery, the bridge would become a death trap. This position violated Article 23 of Wehrmacht combat regulations. Never position snipers in isolated locations without egress routes. But Klaus had watched 2 partners die following regulations. So on the morning of April 7th, at 5:30 a.m., he climbed into his nest and waited. The Soviets came at 6:15 a.m. Klaus watched through his scope as a reconnaissance element, 8 soldiers, approached the southern bank 340 yards away. They moved cautiously, scanning the western bank, looking for the standard sniper positions, looking 55 yards from the water, looking at ground level. They weren't looking up. They weren't looking inside the bridge. Klaus waited until they committed to crossing. 4 entered the water. He selected the lead soldier, a sergeant, directing the others. Klaus accounted for distance, wind, elevation angle. He exhaled halfway. Squeezed. The shot cracked across the river valley. The sergeant collapsed into the water. The other soldiers froze, scanning the western bank, looking for ground-level muzzle flash. Klaus cycled the bolt, selected the second soldier, fired. Hit. The remaining soldiers scattered, taking cover behind riverbank debris. Klaus could see them pointing toward the western bank, calling directions to unseen units. But they were pointing at ground level. 3 seconds later, Soviet return fire erupted. Machine gun bursts raking the shoreline positions where German snipers should have been. But weren't. Klaus waited. At 6:23 a.m., 1 soldier broke cover, running for deeper water. Klaus fired. Hit. The soldier fell. The others stayed frozen behind cover for 11 minutes. Finally, they retreated back to the eastern bank. 3 shots. 3 hits. 13 minutes. No return fire on Klaus's position. The birdcage worked. Klaus remained in position for 6 hours that first day. He engaged Soviet forces 3 more times. By nightfall, he had fired 19 rounds, 17 hits. The Soviets had mortared the western bank repeatedly, shelled the standard sniper positions, sent suppressing fire across every prescribed defensive location. They never looked up. They never looked at the bridge. When Klaus climbed down at 11 RPM, Hauptmann Vogel was waiting. The Hauptmann was 52 years old. A WWI veteran recalled from reserve duty, commanding a regiment that had been reduced to 140 men. He looked at Klaus with an expression somewhere between anger and desperation. "Zimmermann, you were in the bridge." "Yes, Herr Hauptmann. I ordered ground positions, not whatever that was." "Yes, Herr Hauptmann." Vogel was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled out a notebook, opened it. Intelligence reports 17 Soviet casualties on the southern crossing today. Normally, we lose 2 snipers, inflicting that level of damage. Today, we lost 0. He closed the notebook. "Show me this position." At 1 a.m., Klaus led Vogel up into the bridge framework. The Hauptmann studied the nest, ran calculations in his notebook, looked down at the river. Finally, "This violates FM 306. "Yes, Herr Hauptmann?" "It also works." Vogel looked at Klaus. "I can't officially authorize this. If Army Group discovers we're violating field manual protocols, I'll face court-martial. FM 306 exists for reasons." He paused. "However, I am experiencing sudden vision problems. I can barely see what my soldiers are doing. Officially, you're following standard protocol. Unofficially, I see nothing. Train anyone who volunteers." The mockery ended that morning. The soldiers who'd called it the boys' fantasy now wanted to learn. By April 9th, Klaus had trained 6 other soldiers in bridge positioning. They used different parts of the truss structure: north side, south side, varying heights and angles. The Soviets continued shelling ground positions. The Germans continued firing from 50 feet above them. April 10th, 6:41 a.m. Soviet infantry squad at 320 yards. Klaus fired. Hit, 7 seconds. April 10th, 9:18 a.m. Soviet machine gun team positioning on eastern bank. Klaus fired. Hit, 6 seconds. April 11th, 7:55 a.m. Soviet officer coordinating crossing. Klaus fired. Hit, 5 seconds. April the 12th, 10:32 a.m. Soviet sniper in ghillie camouflage, 385 yards. Klaus fired. Hit, 8 seconds. By April 13th, the German defenders using bridge positions had engaged Soviet forces 41 times. Average engagement time, 6.8 seconds. Hit rate, 83%. Casualties, 0. Hauptmann Vogel called Klaus to his bunker on the evening of April 13th. Also present, Oberleutnant Steiner, the regiment's intelligence officer. Steiner spread out reconnaissance photos on the table. "The Soviets know something's wrong," Steiner said. "We've intercepted radio traffic. They're calling this sector the Ghost Bridge. They've lost 57 men trying to cross here. They can't figure out where fire is coming from." He pointed to the photos. "These were taken yesterday by a reconnaissance plane. See anything unusual?" Klaus studied the photos. The bridge, the river, Soviet positions on the eastern bank. Then he saw it. New construction. Heavy machine gun emplacements. Not aimed at the riverbank. Aimed upward. "They're adapting," Vogel said. "They haven't pinpointed the bridge yet, but they're starting to suspect elevated positions. It's only a matter of time." Steiner pulled out another document. "And they're sending specialists. We decoded this transmission 2 hours ago." He read, "Komandiravat Kapitan Volkov, 3 Gvardeyskaya Strelkovaya, Specjalnoye zadanie. He looked up. They're sending Captain Pavel Volkov, 3rd Guards Rifle Division, special assignment. Klaus felt something cold in his stomach. Who is he? Soviet counter-sniper specialist, Steiner said. Age 31. Trained at the Vistral School. 63 confirmed kills, mostly German snipers. The Soviets call him Sokol, the Falcon. He specializes in hunting snipers who use unconventional positions. Steiner looked at Klaus. They're sending him specifically for you. Captain Pavel Volkov arrived at the Oder front on April 14th at 3:00 a.m. He spent 3 hours studying the crossing zone from the eastern bank, analyzing sight lines, calculating angles. At 6:15 a.m., he briefed his spotter, Sergeant Dmitry Kuznetsov. The fire is coming from above ground level, Volkov said. Probably 40-60 feet elevation. The bridge is the only structure that fits. They've built hides in the framework. How many? Kuznetsov asked. Unknown. At least 3, maybe 7. They're rotating positions, varying their timing. Volkov studied the bridge through binoculars. The framework creates 3-dimensional concealment. We can't spot them unless they fire, and even then we're looking at backlit muzzle flash against twisted metal. We need them to reveal themselves. Bait? Kuznetsov asked. Bait, Volkov confirmed. At 6:47 a.m., Klaus watched through his scope as Soviet forces began another crossing attempt. 20 soldiers this time, more than usual. They moved in 2 groups, covering each other. Professional, disciplined. Klaus selected a target. Lead soldier, 340 yards. He was about to fire when something felt wrong. The formation was too exposed. Too obvious. The soldiers were moving like they expected to be hit. He waited. The soldiers reached the water, began crossing. Klaus kept watching. Then he saw it. A reflection. Glass. 420 yards away, in rubble on the eastern bank. Someone with optics. Someone watching the bridge. Klaus shifted his position slowly. Stayed motionless. The Soviet crossing continued. No shots from other German positions. The other snipers had noticed something wrong, too. The Soviets crossed unmolested, reached the western bank, took cover. After 5 minutes, they retreated. It was a probe. The Soviets were trying to provoke fire, trying to pinpoint the bridge positions. Klaus climbed down at 7:30 a.m. and found Hauptmann Vogel. They know. They're hunting us specifically. Vogel nodded grimly. We intercepted another transmission. There's a Soviet counter-sniper team operating on this sector. They're trying to draw you out. Then we don't fire, Klaus said. Wait until they commit to a real crossing. They won't, Vogel said. They'll probe until they locate your positions, then call in artillery. The bridge becomes a death trap. He paused. We're evacuating this sector in 3 days. High Command finally authorized retreat to the Havel line. We just need to hold until April 17th. 3 days. Klaus looked toward the bridge. Somewhere across the river, Captain Volkov was planning his next move. April 14th, 2:15 p.m. Volkov tried again. 15 soldiers, different formation, feigned confusion. Klaus didn't fire. Neither did the other German snipers. April 14th, 5:40 p.m. Another probe. Klaus stayed silent. April 15th, 6:09 a.m. Volkov changed tactics. A single Soviet soldier separated from his unit, apparently lost, wandering near the river. Perfect target. Isolated. Helpless. Klaus watched through his scope. Every instinct said fire, but the soldier was moving too deliberately, too slow. This wasn't panic. This was theater. Klaus didn't fire. The soldier wandered for 20 minutes, then rejoined his unit. Volkov had learned something. The bridge snipers had discipline. They wouldn't fire on obvious bait. April 15th, 11:30 a.m. Klaus was rotating off-duty when Unteroffizier Koch ran into the command bunker. Herr Hauptmann, Soviet assault on the North Crossing. Real engagement. 20-plus infantry with mortar support. Klaus grabbed his rifle, ran toward the bridge, climbed into his nest. By the time he reached position, two other German snipers, Schütze Rolf and Gefreiter Mannheim, were already engaging from different parts of the bridge structure. Klaus scanned the crossing zone. Soviet infantry advancing under mortar cover. He selected targets, fired, cycled the bolt, fired again. 3 shots, 3 hits. Soviet return fire erupted, but it was scattered, unfocused. They still couldn't pinpoint the bridge positions. The assault faltered. After 11 minutes, the Soviets withdrew, leaving 4 casualties on the western bank. Klaus was climbing down when he heard Rolf scream. A single shot. Then silence. Klaus froze. That wasn't Soviet return fire. That was precision shooting. He looked toward Rolf's position, 80 feet north along the bridge framework. Rolf's body hung limp against the cross bracing, a single bullet wound through the chest. Volkov had used the assault as cover. While German snipers were focused on the crossing zone, he'd been watching the bridge, analyzing muzzle flashes, calculating positions. He'd found Rolf's hide and killed him with 1 shot. The hunt had become lethal. April 15th, 7:20 p.m. Volkov killed again. Gefreiter Mannheim, age 20, had been repositioning during a Soviet probe. Volkov spotted the movement, tracked him, fired. Mannheim fell from the bridge structure, hit the ground 50 feet below. He died on impact. 2 German snipers dead in 8 hours. The bridge positions were compromised. Hauptmann Vogel called an emergency meeting at 8:12 p.m. 6 people present. Vogel, Klaus, Oberleutnant Steiner, and the 3 remaining bridge snipers, Schütze Weber, Gefreiter Hoffmann, and Unteroffizier Baumann. "We abandon the bridge positions," Vogel said. "Volkov has figured out our tactics. Staying up there is suicide." "If we abandon them, the Soviets cross freely," Steiner countered. "We need to hold this sector for 48 more hours. Ground positions won't work. We've lost 11 snipers in 3 weeks using ground positions." "Then what do you suggest?" Vogel demanded. Klaus spoke. "We hunt him back." Everyone turned to look at him. "Volkov is operating from the eastern bank," Klaus continued. "He's using the rubble for concealment, probably rotating between 3 or 4 positions. But he has to stay within 450 yards of the bridge to maintain sight lines. That limits his options." "You want to engage in a sniper duel with a specialist who's killed 63 Germans?" Vogel said incredulously. "He's killed 63 Germans who were using predictable tactics," Klaus replied. "He's hunting bridge snipers now because he figured out the pattern. So, we changed the pattern again." Steiner leaned forward. "How?" "We bait him the same way he baited us. 1 sniper visible in the bridge. He takes the shot. We triangulate his position from muzzle flash. 3 other snipers fire simultaneously from concealed positions." Klaus looked around the table. "He's expecting us to hide. We show him 1 target and hit him with 3 angles he can't predict." Vogel was silent for a long moment. "That requires 1 man to expose himself as bait. That man will likely die." "I'll do it," Klaus said immediately. "No," Weber said. "I'm the oldest, 22. You're 17. If anyone—" "I built these positions," Klaus interrupted. "I know the sight lines better than anyone. I know where Volkov can see and where he can't. It has to be me." Vogel looked at the map, looked at Klaus. Finally, "Tomorrow, 6 a.m. We end this." April 16th, 5:30 a.m. Klaus climbed into his original nest for the last time. Weber, Hoffman, and Baumann positioned themselves in 3 separate ground-level hides, 60 yards apart, each with clear sight lines to the eastern bank rubble where Volkov had operated before. Klaus waited. At 6:15 a.m., a Soviet patrol approached the river. Klaus deliberately exposed himself, shifted position, moved too quickly, created visible movement in the bridge framework, making himself a target. The Soviet patrol crossed unmolested. Klaus kept moving, kept making mistakes. "Come on, Volkov. I'm here. I'm exposed." At 6:47 a.m., Oberleutnant Steiner radioed from the observation post. "Movement in eastern bank rubble. 420 yards, Sector 4. Klaus's heart hammered. That was Volkov. He forced himself to keep moving, deliberately silhouetted himself against the morning sky. Every instinct screamed to take cover. Then he saw it. A glint of glass. 420 yards away. Volkov had found him. Klaus held position. 3 seconds. 2. 1. The shot came at 6:48 a.m. Klaus had been waiting for it. The instant he saw the muzzle flash, he dropped flat. The bullet hit the iron beam where his head had been, ricocheted with a scream of metal. Klaus pressed himself against the platform, heart exploding. And 420 yards away, Weber, Hoffman, and Baumann fired simultaneously. Klaus heard 3 shots crack across the river. He forced himself up, looked through his scope. The rubble where Volkov had been was still. A figure slumped forward. "Target down," Weber radioed. "I see the spotter retreating." Klaus exhaled. His hands were shaking. Volkov was dead. The counter-sniper specialist who'd killed 63 Germans had died the same way his victims did. Predictable pattern, triangulated position, simultaneous fire from multiple angles. The hunt was over, but the war continued. April 16th, 3:30 p.m. Soviet forces launched a coordinated assault. 60 infantry, mortar support, machine guns. This wasn't a probe. This was a full offensive to seize the bridge sector before German withdrawal. Klaus and the 3 remaining bridge snipers climbed into position. For 3 hours, they engaged Soviet forces in the largest battle the sector had seen. Klaus fired 47 rounds. Hit rate, 79%. The Soviets kept coming. Mortars bracketed the bridge. Machine gun fire raked the framework. Iron beams sparked where bullets ricocheted. At 5:15 p.m., Soviet forces established a foothold on the western bank. German infantry counterattacked. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted 120 yards from the bridge. Klaus engaged Soviet soldiers at 180 yards, closer than he'd ever fired before. Bolt action, fire, cycle, fire. The rifle burned his hands. At 6:30 p.m., through his scope, Klaus saw a Soviet officer coordinating the assault from 340 yards away. The officer was directing mortar fire, pointing toward German positions, organizing the push. If he wasn't stopped, the line would collapse. Klaus lined up the shot. Distance, 340 yards. Wind, 8 mm from the east. Elevation, 50 feet. Target moving. This was the shot that mattered. Not the longest he'd ever made, not the most difficult, but the most important. If this officer lived, 40 German soldiers would likely die in the next hour. If Klaus missed, he wouldn't get a second chance. Soviet return fire would force him off the bridge. Klaus accounted for wind drift, led the target, exhaled halfway. 2 seconds. 1. He fired. 340 yards away, the Soviet officer collapsed. The assault lost coordination immediately. Mortar fire became erratic. Soviet infantry, without clear direction, began consolidating their foothold rather than pushing. The German counterattack regained momentum. By 7:15 p.m., Soviet forces withdrew back across the river. The sector held. Klaus climbed down from the bridge at 8:01 p.m., his hands raw from the rifle, his ears ringing. Hauptmann Vogel met him at the base. "The withdrawal order came through," Vogel said. "We evacuate at midnight. You held long enough." He looked at Klaus for a long moment. 47 rounds in 3 hours. You kept that assault from breaking through." Klaus just nodded. He was too exhausted to speak. "The bridge technique," Vogel continued quietly. "It worked. 17-day defense, 89 confirmed Soviet casualties, 3 German sniper losses compared to 11 in the previous 3 weeks using ground positions. By any measure, this was a tactical success." "Will you report it?" Klaus asked. Vogel's expression darkened. "I already tried. I submitted a field report to division. They rejected it. Said bridge positioning violates FM 306, Article 23. They're not interested in unconventional tactics from a... They specifically mentioned your age." He paused. "I'm sorry. Klaus, the manual says you're wrong. The casualties say you're right. But the manual wins." The German forces withdrew from the Oder sector on April 17, 1945. The bridge positions were abandoned. Klaus Zimmermann was reassigned to a Wehrmacht unit retreating toward Berlin. He never saw Hauptmann Vogel again. On April 22, 1945, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht issued Training Bulletin 45-17, Tactical Innovations in Defensive Sniper Operations. The bulletin described elevated positioning, angular advantage, 3-dimensional concealment, everything Klaus had developed. The bulletin credited the techniques to systematic analysis by the 9th Army Tactical Development Committee. No mention of Gefreiter Klaus Zimmermann. No mention of the Klessin Bridge. No mention of the 17-year-old who'd built the first position at 2 a.m., while his commanders slept. On April 24th, Hauptmann Vogel attempted to submit Klaus for the Iron Cross Second Class. The nomination cited specific engagements, casualty numbers, tactical innovation under fire. The nomination was denied with a terse response. Tactical innovations are institutional achievements, not individual commendations. Recommend unit citation instead. The unit citation was never issued. By the time it would have been processed, the 9th Army had ceased to exist. The war ended 3 weeks later. Klaus survived. He was captured by Soviet forces on May 2, 1945, during the fall of Berlin. He spent 2 years in a POW camp in Siberia. Released in 1947, returned to his hometown of Stralsund, which was now part of East Germany. He never spoke about the bridge. His family knew he'd been a soldier. They knew he'd survived. They didn't know about elevated positioning, or angular advantage, or the 17 days he'd held the Klessin crossing. Klaus worked for the East German Railway for 34 years. Ironic that he spent his life maintaining the same type of bridges he'd once fought from. He married, had 2 children, lived quietly. Every April 16th, Klaus would walk alone to the Stralsund Bridge near his home and stand there for exactly 17 minutes. His family learned not to ask why. His daughter later said, "We knew something happened during the war. He never told us what." But every April 16th, he'd stand on that bridge like he was waiting for something. Or maybe remembering something. By 1950, the elevated positioning doctrine had spread throughout the militaries of the world, examining lessons from W2U. The U.S. Army Field Manual 23-10, published in 1953, included a section on 3-dimensional sniper positioning, and specifically mentioned railway bridges as potential hide sites. The British Army updated their sniper training in 1951 to include elevated urban positioning. The Soviets, ironically, incorporated bridge-based tactics after capturing German training documents in Berlin. None of these manuals mentioned Klaus Zimmermann. None mentioned the Klessin Bridge. None mentioned the 17-year-old who'd violated doctrine because doctrine was killing his friends. In 1994, a German military historian named Dr. Friedrich Maass was researching defensive operations on the Oder front. He discovered Hauptmann Vogel's rejected field report in an archive in Freiburg. The report was stamped non-compliant with FM 306 and filed away. Maass tracked down the other documents: Vogel's Iron Cross nomination for Klaus, the intelligence reports mentioning Soviet casualties on the Klessin sector, the training bulletin that plagiarized Klaus's tactics. In 1996, Maass located Klaus in Stralsund. He was 68 years old, retired, living in a small apartment near the railway depot. Maass showed him the documents. Klaus read them slowly. When he finished, he said, "I didn't create those tactics for recognition. I created them because Hans and Martin died, and I didn't want to die the same way. If the tactics exist now, if they keep snipers alive, that's what matters." "But you never received credit," Maass said. "The manuals call it institutional innovation. They erased you." "The Wehrmacht erased lots of things," Klaus replied quietly. "At least this thing was useful." Maass published his findings in a 1998 paper, Tactical Innovation Under Duress: The Origins of Elevated Sniper Doctrine, 1945. The paper circulated in military history circles but gained little attention. Klaus declined all interview requests. He died in 2003 at age 75. His funeral was small: family, a few railway co-workers, neighbors. Near the end of the service, 3 elderly men arrived. They introduced themselves to Klaus's daughter as Weber, Hoffmann, and Baumann, the surviving bridge snipers from the Klessin defense. They'd tracked her down through Maass's paper. "Your father saved our lives," Weber said. "Probably 50 lives total. The Wehrmacht forgot him, but we didn't." He handed her a photograph. 4 young soldiers standing beneath a railway bridge, April 1945. Klaus was in the center, 17 years old, rifle over his shoulder. He was the best soldier I ever served with, not because of his shooting, because he thought. Klaus's daughter kept the photograph. In 2015, she donated it, along with Klaus's service records and Hauptmann Vogel's field report, to the German Resistance Memorial Center in Berlin. The materials are filed under Tactical Innovations, 1945. Klaus's name appears on the catalog entry. Visitors rarely notice it. Today, FM 306 includes comprehensive sections on elevated positioning, 3-dimensional concealment, and bridge-based hides. The U.S. Army Sniper School at Fort Moore teaches railway bridge positioning as a standard technique. The British SAS includes bridge tactics in advanced reconnaissance training. Thousands of snipers worldwide have trained in the methods Klaus Zimmermann developed at age 17 in a desperate attempt to survive. Most have never heard his name. The official history credits the technique to the 9th Army Tactical Development Committee. The training manuals reference systematic institutional analysis. The doctrine textbooks cite multiple contributing sources across the late war period. But the truth is simpler. One 17-year-old soldier watched his friends die. He violated doctrine. He climbed into a rusted railway bridge at 2 a.m. because ground positions were death sentences. He built a platform from salvaged boards and wire. He held off 40 Soviet troops for 17 days. And the innovation that saved his life became doctrine that saved thousands more. The Wehrmacht tried to erase him. The army tried to forget him, but the tactics remain. Klaus Zimmermann held the Klessin Bridge. He killed the counter-sniper specialist hunting him. At 340 yards, he dropped the Soviet officer coordinating the assault that would have killed 40 German soldiers. He did it from a position the field manual said was suicidal, and he survived to see his innovation formalized, systematized, and attributed to a committee that never existed. Hit that like button. Subscribe. Drop a comment about the forgotten innovators who changed warfare while the institutions erased their names. Klaus Zimmermann didn't need recognition. He needed to survive. He needed his friends to survive. The bridge positioning worked. 50 soldiers lived because of it. The technique exists in every modern sniper manual. No attribution, no credit, just the innovation, stripped of its creator, institutionalized as if committees invented it in conference rooms rather than teenagers invented it in desperation 50 feet above a frozen river. The army forgot Klaus Zimmermann. But you won't.